The first rays of sun were still struggling to pierce through the morning mist when Thor, the imposing German shepherd with dark fur, once again began his mysterious routine at the Cedar Springs Cemetery. His powerful paws dug with determination at the grave of Farmer Anthony Sullivan, completely ignoring the cold wind that blew through the small Georgia town and made the dry leaves dance between the ancient tombstones. Robert Anderson observed, his dog with a mixture of concern and curiosity. A former army sergeant, a 45-year-old man with graying hair and a penetrating gaze, he had trained Thor since he was a puppy for search and rescue operations. He had never seen the animal behave in such a strange, almost obsessive manner. "What the hell are you sniffing at there, my friend?" muttered Robert, approaching cautiously. Thor stopped for a moment, looked directly at his owner with those expressive and intelligent eyes, barked once toward the black marble tombstone, as if asking permission, and went back to digging with even more intensity. This routine had been going on for over a week. Initially, Robert had believed that Thor was confused, perhaps sniffing out the remains of withered flowers or small rodents that frequently visited the cemetery. But the dog's behavior was very specific, very directed. He always dug at the same spot, always with the same unwavering determination. "Robert Anderson!" The shrill voice of Mrs. Mercer, the cemetery caretaker, echoed among the graves. The 60-year-old woman, as thin as a stick and always dressed in black, approached with hurried steps. "That dog of yours is becoming a tourist. To attraction. Half the town has already passed by to see what he's doing." Robert sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. I try to bring him home, but he always comes back. It's as if he's looking for something specific." "Looking for what?" The caretaker crossed her thin arms. "Anthony Sullivan was a good man, respected by everyone. There's nothing here but a man who departed in peace." At that moment, a brown and white mutt appeared out of nowhere, timidly approaching Thor. To the surprise of everyone present, the stray animal began to dig at the same spot, as if it perfectly understood what the German shepherd was doing. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Mercer, crossing herself. "Now there are two. This isn't natural, Robert. Dogs don't take interest in graves of people who have passed." Robert knelt beside Thor, examining the disturbed soil. The reddish earth, typical of the region, was looser at that spot, as if it had been recently moved. A strange sense of urgency took hold of him, as if Thor was trying to communicate something important. "Thor, what are you trying to tell me?" he whispered, stroking the dog's head. The animal looked fixedly into his owner's eyes, gave two short barks and went back to digging, now accompanied by the mutt. From across the cemetery, Kathy Richards, a young reporter from Valley FM radio, observed the entire scene with keen journalistic interest. At 28, with wavy brown hair and curious eyes, she was always looking for the next big story in Cedar Springs. And this definitely seemed to be an interesting story. "Excuse me," she said, approaching Robert. "I'm Kathy Richards from the local radio station. May I ask a few questions about your dog's behavior?" Robert hesitated. He didn't like exposure, especially when it involved something he didn't understand himself. But perhaps publicity could help clarify the mystery. "Thor is a highly trained search and rescue dog," he explained, keeping a professional tone. "His current behavior is unusual. He's clearly detected something that we humans can't perceive." Kathy turned on her portable recorder. "And do you have any theory about what it might be?" Before Robert could answer, Thor began to bark more, intensely, digging so furiously that his paws had already created a considerable hole in the ground. The mutt accompanied him, as if both knew exactly where they should dig. "He's never done this before," murmured Robert, feeling a shiver run down his spine. "It's as if he knows something that we don't." If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The news spread through town like wildfire. In less than 24 hours, half of Cedar Springs residents had heard about the two dogs that were persistently digging at Anthony Sullivan's grave. In the corner bakery, at the gas station, at the central pharmacy, everyone was commenting on the strange phenomenon. Sheriff Sam Morgan, a 50-year-old man with a graying moustache and a prominent belly, initially received the information with skepticism. Sitting in his worn leather chair at the station, he shook his head as Robert reported the events. "Look, Robert, with all due respect to your work and Thor's training, but a dog is a dog. He could be sniffing anything. A chicken bone someone threw there. A cat that hid. These things happen." "Sam, you've known me for 15 years, replied Robert, leaning forward in his chair. "Thor isn't just any stray. He's trained to detect buried people, specific substances. When he acts like this, there's always a reason." The sheriff sighed, drumming his fingers on the desk. "And what do you suggest I do? That I authorize the exhumation of the body of one of the most respected men in town based on a dog's behavior?" "At least go there and see it with your own eyes," insisted Robert. "Thor found something this morning?" This information made Sam raise his eyebrows. "Found what?" "A small metal box buried near the tombstone. Old rusty. I didn't open it because I thought you should see it first." 2 hours later, Sam was at the cemetery watching Thor and his canine companion dig with unwavering determination. The small metal box rested beside the tombstone, covered in red mud and rust. "Mrs. Mercer," called the sheriff, "when was the last time anyone did any kind of maintenance on this grave?" The caretaker scratched her head, thoughtful. "Must have been about 2 months ago. A company came to do some renovation, replace some loose stones, paid cash up front. I thought it was strange at the time." "Strange why?" "Because Mr. Sullivan's family didn't authorize any renovation. When I asked, the company said it had been requested by Anthony himself before he passed." Sam frowned. "What company was it?" "I don't remember the name. They were outsiders, not from around here." Meanwhile, Kathy Richards circulated through the cemetery with her recorder, interviewing the curious onlookers who gathered to watch the unusual spectacle. Her journalistic instinct told her there was much more here than simple strange animal behavior. "Mr. Jack," she said to the cemetery's oldest gravedigger, "how many years have you worked here?" 42 years, miss. I've seen burials of important people, simple people. I've seen everything in this cemetery." "And have you ever seen a dog behave like this?" The white-haired man slowly shook his head. "Never. Never seen it. A dog might sniff something different, but it doesn't keep digging the same way every day at the same time. It's as if he has an appointment." "And Mr. Sullivan's grave, was there anything different about the burial?" Jack hesitated, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "Look, miss, I don't usually talk about other people's business, but since you asked—" "Yes, I did find it strange." "Strange how?" "The coffin was buried shallower than normal, and the job was rushed, you know. Usually, for an important man like Mr. Sullivan, we take our time, do everything carefully with respect. But that day, everything was very hurried." Kathy felt her heart accelerate. "Rushed why?" "I can't say. But I remember some people arriving at the end of the burial, outsiders, and they were whispering with the funeral home director. After that, everything happened very quickly. At that moment, Thor began to bark more intensely. He had dug deeper and now scratched something solid with his paws. Robert quickly approached, followed by Sheriff Sam. "What is it, Thor?" murmured Robert, kneeling beside the hole. Carefully, he removed the earth and revealed what appeared to be the corner of an old leather suitcase. Sheriff Sam's eyes widened. "My God," he whispered, "what is that animal digging up?" Thor barked twice, as if proud of his discovery, and then looked fixedly at another spot in the cemetery, a few yards away. His gaze was determined, as if he knew exactly where to look next. "Sam," said Robert with a tense voice, "I think we need to authorize a broader investigation. Thor won't stop until he finds everything he's looking for." The sheriff looked at the partially buried suitcase, then at the dog, and finally at the curious and concerned faces of the residents gathering around. He felt that his small, peaceful town was about to discover secrets that might be better left buried forever. The small room at the sheriff's station had never been the scene of such a disturbing discovery. On Sam Morgan's desk, the old leather suitcase lay open, revealing its shocking contents: yellowed bundles of money, contracts without official registration, deeds with suspicious signatures, and an impressive amount of documents that seemed to evidence land grabbing. "My God," murmured Dr. Edward Sullivan, Anthony's eldest son, an elegant 40-year-old man who had arrived from Atlanta as soon as he heard about the discoveries. "This cannot be true. My father was a man of integrity." "Kathy, Richards authorized by the sheriff to follow the investigations to maintain transparency with the population, discreetly photographed the documents while taking notes. Her heart raced with each new piece of evidence. "Edward," said Sam with a careful voice, "some of these contracts show land purchases at values well below market price. And look at this. There are documents about areas that, according to official records, belong to Native American communities." The family lawyer, Mark Sanders, a corpulent man with thick glasses, examined the papers with a grave expression. "Sheriff, it's possible that my client was the victim of some kind of frame-up. These documents could have been planted." "Planted by whom?" questioned Robert, who was observing the scene in silence. Thor wasn't looking for documents. He was following a specific trail. At that moment, the sheriff's secretary entered the room hurriedly. "Sheriff Morgan, there's an urgent call. It's from the Central Registry Office. They say it's about Mr. Sullivan's will." Sam answered the phone, and his face gradually paled as he listened to the conversation. When he hung up, everyone present was looking at him expectantly. "Anthony Sullivan's official will has disappeared from the registry's archives," he announced with a tense voice. "The only digital copy was also corrupted in the system. No one can explain how this happened." Dr. Edward staggered, needing to support himself on a chair. "What do you mean it disappeared? That's impossible." "There's more," continued Sam. "We found this at the bottom of the suitcase." He held up an old feminine ring made of worked gold with a bright blue stone, and this rusty key with initials that don't correspond to your father's name. Kathy approached to examine the objects. "May I photograph them? Perhaps someone in town will recognize these items." "No," exclaimed Dr. Edward, almost shouting. "We cannot expose my family to this scandal. My father built a respected name in this region. I will not allow his memory to be tarnished based on dubious evidence." "Edward," said Mark, touching his client's arm, "we need to stay calm. The truth always comes out, and it's better if we cooperate with the investigations." Robert, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "There's something you need to know. Thor hasn't stopped searching. Yesterday afternoon he began digging at another spot in the cemetery, near an unmarked grave." "Unmarked?" asked Sam. "The tombstone has only a partially erased date. Mrs. Mercer said it's a very old grave, of someone who was buried without identification." Kathy felt a thrill run down her spine. What if that ring belongs to the person buried in that unmarked grave? Dr. Edward became visibly nervous. "These are absurd speculations. You're building conspiracy theories based on an animal's behavior." "A highly trained animal," corrected Robert firmly. "Thor detects things that we can't. If he's searching in another grave, there's a reason." At that moment, the door of the station opened abruptly. An elegant woman of approximately 50 years, dressed in black, entered with determined steps. Her dark hair was tied in an impeccable bun, and her dark green eyes shone with a mixture of anger and desperation. "I am Helen Sullivan, Anthony's widow," she announced with a firm but trembling voice. "I've come to retrieve my husband's belongings that you improperly removed from his grave." Dr. Edward rose quickly. "Mother, I didn't know you had returned from New York." "I returned as soon as I heard about this absurdity," replied Helen, not taking her eyes off the sheriff. "Sheriff Morgan, I demand that you return everything to where it was. My husband deserves to rest in peace." Sam showed her the ring and the key. "Mrs. Sullivan, do you recognize these objects?" Helen stared at the pieces for a long moment. Her expression subtly changed, as if a painful memory had been awakened. She extended a trembling hand toward the ring, but stopped herself before touching it. "I've never seen these things in my life," she said, but her voice faltered slightly on the last word. Kathy carefully observed the widow's reaction. As an experienced journalist, She knew how to recognize when someone wasn't being completely honest. Helen Sullivan definitely knew more than she was saying. "Thor wants to show us something else," said Robert, breaking the tense silence. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to take him to the cemetery now. Perhaps we'll find answers to all these questions." The cemetery was more crowded than ever. Curious onlookers gathered among the tombstones, whispering theories and speculations about the recent events. Thor, oblivious to the crowd, headed directly to the unmarked grave, followed closely by Robert, Sheriff Sam, and Kathy. Helen Sullivan had refused to accompany the group, claiming that she couldn't bear to see more desecrations in the cemetery where her husband should rest in peace. Dr. Edward, on the other hand, couldn't resist his curiosity and walked a few steps behind, visibly nervous. "Look," murmured Kathy, pointing to the nameless tombstone. "The date is almost completely erased, but I can see some numbers. It seems to be from 20 years ago." Jack, the gravedigger, approached the group. "If I may, I can tell you what I know about this grave," he said, removing his hat as a sign of respect. "Please, Mr. Jack," encouraged Sam. "This grave has always been a mystery here in the cemetery. The woman was buried on a rainy dawn, exactly 20 years ago. I was just starting to work here. I was still very young. I remember finding it strange because there was no wake, no family present, nothing." "And who authorized the burial?" asked the sheriff. "It was Anthony Sullivan himself. He said it was a person without family, without resources, and that he was paying for the burial out of Christian charity." Dr. Edward paled. "My father was always charitable." "Yes, sir. But the strange thing is that he specifically asked not to put a name on the tombstone, said the woman had requested this before passing, that she wanted to be remembered only by God." Thor began to dig on the left side of the tombstone, exactly as he had done at Anthony's grave. The mutt that had accompanied him in previous days appeared again, as if they had a scheduled meeting. "This is unbelievable," murmured Robert. "It's as if he knows exactly where to look." Kathy turned on her recorder. "Mr. Jack, do you remember any other details about that night?" The gravedigger scratched his grey head. "I remember that Anthony was very nervous, looking in all directions as if expecting someone to arrive. And there was an elegant woman with him, all dressed in black, with a veil over her face. She was crying a lot." "Would you describe this woman better?" asked Sam, taking out his notebook. "It was hard to see with the veil, but she was a tall, elegant lady. She had dark hair and wore strong perfume, the expensive kind. I remember because she dropped a glove near the grave, and when I went to return it, she was trembling so much she could barely hold it." Dr. Edward swallowed hard. You think it was my mother?" "Edward," said Sam gently, "we need to ask your mother some questions. That doesn't mean she did anything wrong." At that moment, Thor barked loudly and began to dig more furiously. His paws had found something solid buried beside the grave. Robert approached to help, and together they managed to unearth a small, wooden box similar to an antique jewelry box. "My God," whispered Kathy, "what could be in there?" Carefully, Sam opened the box. Inside were letters yellowed by time, old photographs, and a gold bracelet with the initials M.R. engraved. "M.R.," murmured the sheriff. "The same initials on the key we found in Anthony's suitcase." Dr. Edward approached to get a better look at the photographs. His face went livid when he recognized one of the images, a young and beautiful woman with brown hair and a radiant smile, posing next to a man who was unmistakably his father, but 20 years younger. "Dad," he whispered, taking the photograph with trembling hands. One of the letters was open, and Kathy could read some words written in a delicate feminine handwriting. "My dear Anthony, I know our situation is complicated, but the love I feel for you is greater than any obstacle." "This can't be happening," murmured Dr. Edward, running his hands through his hair. "My father was a faithful man, dedicated to his family." Jack, who had observed everything in silence, finally spoke. "Mr. Edward, I wouldn't want to be the bearer of bad news, but since things have come to this point, the woman buried here, she was expecting a baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Edward staggered, needing to lean on a nearby tombstone. Kathy felt her heart race. This story was becoming much more complex than she had imagined. "How do you know that?" asked Sam. "Because I helped prepare the body for burial," replied Jack, lowering his voice. "The woman was in her 5th month of pregnancy. I remember because it impressed me greatly. She was so young, so beautiful." Thor, as if feeling that his mission was coming to an end, stopped digging and sat beside the hole he had made. His intelligent gaze alternated between those present, as if waiting for them to finally understand what he was trying to reveal. "Is there anything else buried here?" Robert asked his canine companion. Thor barked once and looked fixedly at Dr. Edward, as if knowing that the next discoveries would profoundly affect this man who was desperately trying to protect his father's memory. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The Sullivan House, an imposing colonial construction in the center of Cedar Springs, had never been the scene of such a tense confrontation. Helen Sullivan was seated in her burgundy velvet armchair, her trembling hands holding a cup of tea that was cooling without her noticing. In front of her, Dr. Edward paced from one side of the room to the other, while Sheriff Sam and Kathy occupied the leather sofa. "Mother, I need you to tell me the truth," said Edward, stopping in front of her. "These photographs, these letters, who was this woman?" Helen closed her eyes for a long moment, as if gathering strength to face a ghost from the past. When she opened them again, they were full of tears. "Marianne Rodriguez," she whispered, with an almost inaudible voice. "Her name was Marianne Rodriguez." "And what did she mean to Dad?" insisted Edward. Your father loved her," admitted Helen, each word coming out like a painful confession. "They met at an agricultural business fair in Atlanta. She was a teacher, 25. Years old, intelligent, educated, dreamy." Kathy made discreet notes while recording the conversation. Her journalistic experience told her that Helen was being sincere, but still hiding important details. "Mother, how did you find out?" Helen let out a bitter laugh. "A woman always knows, Edward. Your father started taking frequent trips, invented business commitments, came home with different perfume on his clothes. When I confronted him, he initially denied it, but then he told me everything." "And you forgave him?" asked Sam gently. "Forgive?" Helen abruptly stood up, beginning to walk around the room. "Sheriff, forgiveness implies forgetting, and I never managed to forget, especially when she became pregnant with his child." Dr. Edward sat heavily in a chair. "So it's true. Dad had a child with this woman." "Would have had," corrected Helen with a broken voice, "if things had been different." "What happened, Mrs. Sullivan?" asked Kathy with delicacy. Helen sat down again, breathing deeply before continuing. "Marianne wanted Anthony to divorce me. She said we deserved to be a real family, that the child needed to grow up knowing the father. Anthony was divided, confused. And what did you do?" I offered her money, a lot of money, for her to leave Georgia, start a new life in another state, raise the child far from here." Edward stood up again, shocked. "Mother, how could you?" "I was desperate," exploded Helen, finally releasing years of repressed emotions. "Marianne was young, beautiful, full of life, and me, I was just the 40-year-old betrayed wife trying to keep my family together." "And did she accept the money?" asked Sam. Helen shook her head. "No. She said love couldn't be bought, that she'd rather be poor beside Anthony than rich away from him. She said she would go to town, that she would tell everyone about their relationship." A heavy silence took over the room. Kathy could hear her own heart beating as she waited for the continuation of the story. "That's when she disappeared," continued Helen with an almost inaudible voice. "One night, she simply vanished. Anthony was desperate, searched everywhere, hired private detectives, offered rewards, nothing. And you never heard from her again?" 3 weeks later, a farmer in the region found Found her on a dirt road near the river. It had been an accident. Her car went off the road on a dangerous curve during a storm. Dr. Edward covered his face with his hands. "My godmother, why did you never tell us any of this?" "Because your father never forgave himself," replied Helen, with tears running down her face. "He believed that if he had made a decision faster, if he had had the courage to publicly assume the relationship, Marianne wouldn't have gone out alone on that stormy night. That's why he paid for her burial," murmured Sam, understanding. "Anthony insisted on giving her a dignified burial, but he asked not to put a name on the tombstone because he said she deserved to rest in peace, away from the judgments and gossip of the town." Kathy looked at her notes. "Mrs. Sullivan, what about the lands, the documents we found in the buried suitcase?" Helen sighed deeply. After Marianne passed, Anthony changed completely. He became obsessed with making a fortune, as if accumulating wealth could compensate for her loss. He started making questionable deals, buying lands at too low prices, ignoring the dubious origin of some properties. "And you knew?" "I tried not to know. I pretended not to see the suspicious documents, the secret meetings, the money that appeared without clear explanation. I was tired of fighting, of questioning, of trying to keep our family together." Edward stood up and went to the window, looking at the town he had always known as a peaceful and honest place. "So our father wasn't the man we thought he was?" "No," said Helen softly. "He was a passionate man who made terrible mistakes trying to deal with guilt and regret." At that moment, Sam's phone rang. He answered quickly, and his expression changed drastically during the conversation. "Thank you, I'll send someone to get it," he said, hanging up. "What was it?" asked Edward. "Thor found something else in the cemetery. A third person was irregularly buried 20 years ago, in the same period as Marianne Rodriguez." Helen Sullivan paled and needed to support herself on the arm of the armchair. "Who?" she whispered. "We don't know yet. But from the characteristics of the grave, it appears to be a child." The cemetery was in complete uproar. A small crowd had formed around the site where Thor had made his most recent discovery. Robert observed his dog with a mixture of admiration and concern. Thor seemed exhausted but determined to complete his mysterious mission. "Robert," called Sheriff Sam, who had just arrived with Helen and Edward, "what exactly did Thor find?" "A small grave, very discreet, almost hidden behind the Fernandez mausoleum," explained Robert, pointing to a shaded area of the cemetery. "It doesn't have a tombstone, just a small wooden cross that's already half rotted." Jack, the gravedigger, approached the group with a somber expression. "I remember that grave," he said, removing his hat. "It was made at the same time as the young woman's, Marianne Rodriguez. It was also Mr. Sullivan who authorized it." Helen Sullivan staggered, needing to lean on her son's arm. Her face was as pale as paper, and her hands visibly trembled. "Mother." "What's happening?" asked Edward, concerned about Helen's state. I need to sit down," she murmured, seeking support on a nearby tombstone. Kathy carefully observed Helen's reaction. Her journalistic experience told her that the widow knew exactly what Thor had found. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said gently, "you know who's buried there, don't you?" Helen closed her eyes and slowly shook her head. "I hoped this day would never come," she whispered. "What day, Mother?" insisted Edward. "The day when the complete truth would come to light." Sam approached Helen carefully. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to tell me everything. We can't continue the investigation without knowing the facts." Helen took several deep breaths before speaking. "The child that Marianne was expecting, it survived. The accident." A shocked silence took over the group. Edward's eyes widened, unable to fully process what he had just heard. "What do you mean survived?" asked Sam. "Marianne was taken to the regional hospital still alive," explained Helen with a broken voice. "The doctors managed to save the baby through emergency surgery. It was a girl." "And where is this child now?" asked Kathy, her heart racing. Helen looked directly at Edward before answering. "She lived only 3 days." "My God," whispered Edward, understanding the dimension of the tragedy. "Anthony spent those 3 days at the hospital, holding that little girl's hand, promising he would take care of her, that he would give her a dignified life," continued Helen, with tears running down her face. When she passed, he was completely destroyed. Jack confirmed with a nod. I remember Mr. Sullivan in those days. He would come to the cemetery at dawn, spend hours standing between the two graves, whispering as if asking for forgiveness. And it was like this for 20 years, asked Robert. Every day until a few months before he himself passed, replied Jack. Sometimes he brought flowers, sometimes he just stood there in silence. Dr. Edward walked in circles, trying to process all the information. So I have a sister buried here in the cemetery? A sister I never knew. Half-sister, corrected Helen, softly. And you didn't know her because I asked your father not to tell you children. I thought it would be better that way. Better for whom, Mother? Exploded Edward. For you, who wanted to pretend none of this happened. For our family, replied Helen, abruptly standing up. Edward, you and your sister Isabel were just children at the time. How could I explain that your father had a daughter with another woman? How would that help you grow up? Kathy, who had remained silent recording everything, finally asked the question everyone was thinking. Mrs. Sullivan, if Anthony visited the graves regularly, why did Thor only start digging now? What changed? Helen looked at Thor, who was sitting patiently beside Robert, as if waiting to be called for his next mission. Because Anthony isn't really buried here, she said, with an almost inaudible voice. What do you mean? Asked Sam, frowning. Anthony didn't die as everyone thinks, revealed Helen completely, shocking everyone present. 3 days before the supposed wake, he came to me and said he couldn't live with the weight of guilt anymore, that he needed to leave forever, start a new life somewhere else. Mother, that's impossible, exclaimed Edward. I saw his body in the coffin. You saw an unknown man who died at the regional hospital on the same day. Anthony bribed funeral home employees to make the switch. The money you found in the suitcase was to pay all the people involved in the scheme. Robert finally understood Thor's behavior. That's why Thor could smell that something was wrong. There was no trace of Anthony in the grave because he was never there. And where is my father now? Asked Edward with a desperate voice. Helen looked at the horizon as if she could see beyond the mountains that surrounded Cedar Springs. I don't know, Edward. He told me it was better this way, that it would be easier for all of us if we thought he had permanently departed. Thor stood up and walked to Helen, looking fixedly into her eyes as if he could read her thoughts. Then, surprisingly, he barked twice toward the cemetery exit and began walking in that direction. I think Thor hasn't finished his search yet, said Robert, intrigued. He wants to take us somewhere. Thor walked with determination through the streets of Cedar Springs, as if following an invisible map etched in his memory. Robert, Sheriff Sam, Edward, Helen, and Kathy followed him in a silent procession, each lost in their own thoughts about the shocking revelations of the past few days. The dog guided the group to the old road that led to the farms on the outskirts of town. After about 20 minutes of walking, he stopped in front of a small property that everyone knew, the old Olson farm, which had been sold a few months ago to a mysterious buyer whom no one in town had personally met. Thor, is this where you want to take us? Asked Robert, observing the simple but well-maintained house with a spacious porch and flowering garden. The dog barked once and ran toward the wooden gate. Before anyone could stop him, he jumped over the low fence and darted toward the house. Let's go, said Sam, determined. We've come this far, we need to see this through to the end. As they approached the porch, the front door slowly opened. A man of approximately 60 appeared in the doorway, graying hair, stubble, simple clothes of a rural worker. His eyes, however, were unmistakably the same eyes that Edward had inherited. Anthony, whispered Helen, placing her hand on her chest. Hello, Helen, he responded, with a tired but gentle voice. I knew this day would come. Thor was always smarter than all of us. Edward was paralyzed, observing the man whose funeral he had cried at just 3 months before. Dad, you're really alive? Anthony slowly descended the porch steps, as if each movement hurt. I'm alive, son, but I'm not living. How could you do this to us? Exploded Edward, alternating between anger and relief. We suffered, we cried, we thought we had lost our father. And you did, replied Anthony, sadly. The man you knew as a father died the day Marianne and our daughter departed. What remained was just a ghost trying to escape from his mistakes. Thor approached Anthony and sat beside him, like an old friend meeting another after a long separation. The farmer stroked the dog's head affectionately. "He would visit me every dawn," explained Anthony. "At first I thought it was coincidence that he had gotten lost and found my property by chance, but Thor always knew where I was." "Why did you do this?" asked Helen with a broken voice. "Why did you abandon us?" Anthony looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. "Because I couldn't look at you anymore, without seeing what I had destroyed. Every time Edward smiled, I saw the smile of the daughter I never knew. Every time you hugged me, Helen, I remembered Marianne's arms." "But we could have overcome this together," said Edward with tears in his eyes. "No, son, some mistakes are too big to be forgiven. And mine weren't just against you. They were against this entire town that respected me. Against the families I harmed with my dishonest business. Against the lands I stole from those who needed them most." Kathy, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. "Mr. Sullivan, what did you intend to do with all that buried money?" "It was for you," he replied, looking at Edward and Helen. "I knew that one day the truth would come out. The money was to compensate for the lands that would have to be returned, the lawsuits you would face because of my actions." "And the false deeds, the grabbing of Native American lands?" asked Sam. Anthony lowered his head, ashamed. "After I lost Marianne and the baby, I went crazy. I thought that by accumulating wealth I could somehow compensate for what I had lost. I made deals with terrible people, bought lands that I knew weren't legally sold, harmed entire families." "Dad," said Edward, approaching him with hesitation, "we can fix this. Together. Return the lands. Compensate the families harmed. Rebuild our life." Anthony looked into his son's eyes with an expression of deep sadness. "Edward, you don't understand. It's not just about money or properties. There are people who were harmed in ways that no money can repair. Families that lost their homes, their traditions, their dignity, because of my actions." Helen approached her husband. "Anthony, I forgave you a long time ago, for the mistakes, for the infidelity, for the cowardice, but I never forgave you for abandoning us." "Helen?" "No," she interrupted him firmly. "You were afraid to face the consequences of your actions and chose to run away. You let your children grow up thinking their father was a hero, when in reality he was just a frightened man." Thor stood up and walked to Edward, pressing his muzzle against his hand as if trying to console him. The young man stroked the dog, finally understanding that Thor had found not only buried secrets, he had found an opportunity for healing for a shattered family. "What do we do now?" asked Edward, looking alternately at his father and mother. "Now," said Anthony, taking a deep breath, "I go back home and face the consequences of my actions. It's time to stop running." Kathy turned off her recorder, realizing that some moments were too sacred to be recorded. Thor barked softly, as if approving Anthony's decision, and for the first time in weeks his gaze seemed peaceful. The sun was setting completely behind the mountains when the Sullivan family began walking together back to Cedar Springs, followed by a dog that had fulfilled his most important mission, reuniting a family that love had separated and that only truth could unite again. 6 months had passed since the day Thor unearthed the deepest secrets of Cedar Springs. The small Georgia town still commented on the events, but now with the tone of a community that had learned that truth, however painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. Anthony Sullivan was sitting in the defendant's chair in the Cedar Springs courthouse, awaiting the reading of Judge Franklin Adams's sentence. The man who had once been the most respected farmer in the region now faced the consequences of his actions with the dignity he should have shown 20 years earlier. Considering the defendant's spontaneous confession, his full cooperation with justice in the return of irregularly acquired lands, and the fact that a large part of his assets were voluntarily allocated to repair the damages caused to the affected communities, said the judge, adjusting his glasses. This court sentences Anthony Sullivan to 2 years in semi-open regime with community service. Edward, seated in the first row of the public, sighed with relief. He had feared a much more severe sentence for his father. Helen, at his side, firmly held his hand, demonstrating the unconditional support she had promised to give her husband during the process of rebuilding their lives. Thor was lying quietly at Robert's feet, who was also attending the hearing. The dog had become a small local celebrity, constantly visited by journalists and curious people who wanted to meet the detective dog that had unraveled the greatest mystery in Cedar Springs history. Additionally, continued the judge, I determined that the defendant must continue participating in the land restitution program, working directly with the harmed Native American communities to ensure that all rights are properly restored. Kathy Richards, now a correspondent for a major Atlanta newspaper, after the national repercussion of her coverage of the case, was taking notes for her final article on the outcome of the story. Her exemplary journalistic work throughout the investigation had opened doors for her career, but she knew she would never forget the lesson she had learned in Cedar Springs, that the best stories are those that touch the human heart. After the hearing, the Sullivan family gathered at the municipal cemetery. Anthony had asked to visit the graves of Marianne Rodriguez and his daughter before beginning to serve his sentence. Marianne, he whispered, kneeling before the tombstone that now bore the full name of the woman he had loved. I know I can never fully forgive myself for what happened, but I promise I will spend the rest of my life trying to repair the harm I caused. Helen placed her hand on her husband's shoulder. Anthony, Marianne wouldn't want to see you punishing yourself forever. She was a generous woman who believed in forgiveness and the possibility of new beginnings. How do you know? He asked, raising his moist eyes. Because I finally read the letters she wrote to you, replied Helen with a sad but sincere smile. In recent weeks, while we were organizing the documents for the trial, I found the courage to read everything. She really loved you, Anthony. And a woman who loves like that wouldn't hold a grudge. Edward approached the smaller grave where his half-sister was buried. Sophia, he said, reading the name that had been engraved on the new tombstone. We chose this name because it means wisdom, and it was wisdom that you brought. Thus, even without ever having had the chance to grow up, Thor approached the graves and lay between them like a silent guardian. Since the secrets had been revealed, the dog seemed to finally be at peace, as if his mission had been completed. Thor, said Robert, stroking his companion's head. You taught us that some secrets need to come to light for people to heal. 3 months later, Anthony was working at a small rural school that he had helped build in one of the Native American communities he had harmed with his past actions. His hands, once accustomed to signing dubious contracts, now carried bricks and mixed cement to raise classrooms. Mr. Sullivan, said Caleb, a 15-year-old Native American youth, do you think our school will be ready before the next school? Yeah, it will, young man, replied Anthony, wiping the sweat from his forehead. And when it is, I want you to promise me something. What? That you'll study hard and become a fair leader for your people. That you'll protect your land and your culture without ever forgetting that dialogue and honesty are the best tools for resolving conflicts. Caleb smiled. I promise, but you also need to promise me something. What? That you'll keep helping us even after you finish your sentence. We like having you here. Anthony felt his eyes water. For the first time in 20 years, he felt he was doing something truly important with his life. That night, when he returned home, he found Helen preparing dinner and Edward playing with Thor in the yard. The scene was simple, every day, but for Anthony it represented everything he had almost lost forever. How was work today? Asked Helen, kissing him on the forehead. It was good, he replied, hugging her. You know what's strange? I feel richer now, working with my hands and earning minimum wage, than I felt when I had all those lands and money. That's because, now you're rich in what really matters, said Edward, joining the family embrace. Thor barked happily in the yard as if approving the scene. Robert, who visited them regularly, always said he had never seen the dog so satisfied and peaceful. As the sun set behind the mountains of Cedar Springs, the Sullivan family prepared for another night together, no longer as people fleeing from their secrets, but as a family that had learned that true love can survive the worst storms. And Thor, lying in his favorite corner in the yard, slept peacefully, knowing he had fulfilled the most important mission of his life, proving that even the most buried secrets can be transformed into opportunities for new beginnings when there is enough love to face the truth. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Tell us what city you're watching from.